Hello. So, we are going to continue with Victorian poetry and the social and intellectual background of the Victorian age. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the imperialism or the colonialism that happened in the Victorian age and what effect it might have had on Victorian poetry, especially the two poems that we have in our syllabus. Now, doing a small recap, in that video about the Victorian identity, I talked about the political stability that existed in these times, the Victorian age. Now, it was a very long reign under a single monarch, that is Queen Victoria, from 1837 to 1901, and for more than 63 long years, Britain had a stable government. And one of the fundamental aim, let's say, of this government, priority of this government rather, was expansion. And I've also said this quote that the sun never sets on the British Empire, if you remember. Now, expansion was always in the cards when it came to Queen Victoria's reign. And expansion, of course, meant the colonial expansion, and the result was this huge British Empire covering one major part of the whole world. Now, Queen Victoria's reign was characterized by this desire to find and colonize new nations, new land. This was the desire that resulted into such wide colonial expansion. Now, British Empire under Queen Victoria, it expanded across the globe and strengthened its title as a world superpower. Now, it acquired the largest empire the world had ever seen, and it included Ireland, Canada, India, Australia, New Zealand, parts of South America, parts of Africa, the Caribbean like the West Indies, other parts of Asia like Burma, now it's called Myanmar, even parts of Hong Kong. So it's a huge empire, and it was the largest empire the world had ever seen. That happened under Queen Victoria's reign. And it is said that this British Empire, it extended over 1/5 of the Earth's surface, and almost a quarter of the world's population, that is 25% of the world population, that had been living under one monarch, that is Queen Victoria. And all this because there was this spirit, this desire to find and colonize new nations, that was the spirit of this Victorian age. We will see how this is reflected in the poetry that we have in our syllabus. Now, as the empire expanded, this British imperial empire expanded, wars were fought. Now, British soldiers, in fact, fought wars in almost every year of Victoria's reign, because it was very difficult to control this huge empire. To be honest, the whole approach was divided. The colony's approach to this imperial rule was divided. While some people actually felt very honored to be under the greatest monarch that the world had ever seen, that is Queen Victoria, some people from these colonies actually felt honored that they are under Queen Victoria's reign. But there were numerous struggle for independence. There were strong resistance from many colonies. And as to fight or as to contain these rebellions, these small rebellions that continued to happen in almost all colonies, this British army or the British officers who actually worked in these colonies were in the spirit of a constant action, because almost every year there happened to be some rebellion in some part of this huge British imperial rule. And as if this British army or these British officers, they had to be always mentally and strategically prepared to contain the rebellion, to expand the empire. They had to be in the spirit of constant action. We'll see even the spirit being reflected in the poems. Another interesting thing was the supremacy of the British naval in this Victorian age, the Royal Navy of Britain, as it was called. And in the words of W.S. Gilbert, when Britain really ruled the waves in good Queen Bess's time. So the Navy, the Royal Navy of Britain was supreme, it was very powerful. And more than powerful, what is more important is that the Englishmen, they really loved their navy. The common English populace, they really loved their navy so much that it was almost a favorite topic of literature, art and culture. This whole thing about the British Royal Navy was really reflected in literature, art and culture. Now, why was this imperialism or this colonialism important? The first thing is that this imperial rule actually fueled the Industrial Revolution. That was the topic of our previous lecture. Actually, imperialism and Industrial Revolution, the industrialization of Britain rather, they actually complement each other. Now, these colonies, because it was a huge imperial kingdom, these colonies actually provided the resources and the raw materials for this industrial revolution to happen. Money was taken in from the colonies, and taken in is rather a very decent way to say it. Actually, money was stolen, money was robbed from the colonies, huge wealth was brought in from these colonies, and these resources, these raw materials, this money was actually used to fuel the industrial revolution further in Britain. Now, as a result of that industrial revolution, there was mass productions, there was factories, jobs and industrial growth. And this again was in return sold to these colonies, and Britain even made a profit. Now, not only the products sold, but many habits were also sold, because for once, the drinking of tea and coffee for leisure was not a part of the Indian culture ever. It was only in this time that in a larger section of Indian society, this habit of drinking tea and coffee was actually done by the British, and they started to sell tea in a huge scale. Because they produced it in a huge scale, they started selling this tea to India. Now, products were sold, habits were sold, and further profits were made. Now, there are several reasons why having such a huge imperial kingdom is important. And there were, of course, other developments that was based on this huge industrial power that now Britain was. Now, another thing that showed up with this industrial revolution, with this industrialization, was the consumerism and a kind of a show-off culture. Now, this upper caste consumerist culture, that is supposed to come with an industrial boom that happened, and it resulted in this habit of buying beyond the necessity and buying just to show off. Now, the upper class, they bought several things like furnitures, costly paintings and everything, decors, just to show off and just to maintain this difference from the middle and the lower classes. And also, Britain had a habit of acquiring exotic items from the colonies. And acquiring is, again, a very mellowed down term. They stole a lot of things like the Kohinoor diamond, which was actually a which is supposed to have been mined in undivided India, pre-independence undivided India, but it was stolen and taken away. So that's what it is believed, at least in popular culture. There are other narratives about it. But so these show off culture, this consumerist culture actually developed with both industrialization and this imperial rule. The peak of this consumerist culture was that happened something that happened in 1851. It's called the Great Exhibition that happened in this era. It was a series of fairs and exhibitions of culture and industry. It was a huge display, it was a huge show off for the Britain. The prime motive for Britain was to make clear to the world its role as industrial leader. That's what the official narrative was, that Britain wants to make it clear to the whole world that Britain itself was the biggest industrial superpower. But there are other interpretations to it. Now historians, now critics interpret this as the commodity culture that had seen its height. It's kind of an attention seeking, it's kind of a show off, it's a culture of distraction and materialism. And we will see even this getting reflected in the poems that you have. Now let's move on to the poems and see if any of these gets reflected in how these things get reflected in the poems that are from your syllabus. I have here Ulysses, and one of the most popular interpretation of Ulysses is seeing the figure of Ulysses as an imperialist explorer, as a colonizer. And he says that it's not too late to seek a newer world. And he says, much have I seen and known cities of men and manners, climates, councils, and governments, myself not least but honored of them all. Now, it's not to seek a newer world. This is, if I go up, this is the desire to find and colonize new nations that gets reflected in Ulysses. And much have I seen and known, and he describes these colonies that differed greatly from each other. Like they have a variety of colonies, like India, which was so different from Africa and South America, which was different from the Indies, the Hong Kong and the other parts of Asia that differed from Africa. So this variety of imperial nations, these colonies that the British had, is reflected in these lines of Ulysses. And he says that myself not least but honored of them all. Now Ulysses, being a representative of the British imperialist, he says, I am honored of them all, I am the most honorable. This is the prejudice, this is the pride that was there in every common Victorian man, that actually had huge pride of being a British in this industrial age, in this era of industrialization. So Britain was most honored. It was the superpower. It was the owner of the greatest, greatest series of colony that this world had ever seen. So that is why he is the most honored of them all. Now, there is of course a reflection of the supremacy of the navy, because he says that my mariners, and that gets reflected here, and he says, there lies the port, the vessel puffs her sail. It is an image of a very powerful ship that sails through the sea, that has the power to travel across the world to actually colonize new nations. So the vessel puffs her sail. And there is also a reflection of the spirit of constant action, because Ulysses says, for my purpose hold to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all western stars until I die. So the whole life should be a life of action. That was the spirit of this Victorian age, and this is the spirit of constant action. So we see Ulysses, if we interpret Ulysses like this, so he becomes an imperial officer or army. Now moving on to The Last Duchess, which is another poem in your syllabus, and this reflects the materialist culture. Now you see the Duke, he mentions Fra Pandolf, and I don't know how it's pronounced anyway, and then at the end of this poem he says, notice Neptune, which claws of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. Now Duke of Ferrara, the Duke in this poem My Last Duchess, he's a connoisseur and he's a collector of art objects, and he's a collector of art objects, and he displays this object to people who visits him privately, and he displays this, he shows this off in order to impress people. He is not a lover of art. Now this is exactly the difference between the Romantic age and the Victorian age. The Romantic age had people who loved literature and loved art and loved nature, and in Victorian age this person, this Duke, is very representative of the spirit of this age, because this show of culture actually existed in Britain. They bought costly paintings, they bought exotic sculptures and many forms of art they bought. Many had personal libraries where there were thousands of books, but they never read these books, nor did they understand the art. It was only for show off, and that is a kind of materialist culture that existed. What's very shocking in Last Duchess is that the Last Duchess to this Duke of Ferrara is also another object for him, and so will be the next Duchess which he is planning to marry. Now this show of culture, this consumerist culture actually creeped in to personal relationships and marriage. It didn't limit itself to art only, art and culture only, but it creeped into personal relationships, so much so that this Duke of Ferrara, he prides himself because he had a very pretty woman as his last Duchess, whom he has now killed, and he wants to marry another pretty woman who will be his next Duchess, as if these women are objects to him. So this is the end of the section. There are very few points left about the social and intellectual background, after which we will start with the two poems. Thank you.